Okay, so if I could have our last 5 speakers come down and sit down here, we have a time for discussion with the whole panel here. I'm hoping there's some great interest from the audience. I think there's been a lot of new ideas introduced in this last session that I'd love to see fleshed out a bit more. So, turn on some lights, please. And we do have microphones for those of you who have questions. So, anybody want to throw out the first question? It's very late in the day. I freely acknowledge that. Or very early. Either way, we should be asleep, right? Oh, sorry, Emmanuel. Yeah.
Okay, mine goes to the one who spoke from the business perspective. What I do know is that business people are interested in profit. And so what I want to find out is for everything that your people are doing, do they still have in mind to make profit?
Yes.
Then I'm sorry to say it will not work, because then, once the motive is to make profit, what it then means is that everything you are doing, you are looking at your own interest. But from the discussions that have gone on so far, I think that the interest should rather be at the other end, in which case, instead of, say, looking at it from a commercial marketing point, we should rather be looking at it from a social marketing point. And when that comes in, then it means that the person to benefit at the end of the day is the one at the receiving end. And so you possibly would have to re-look at it, because then if profit is the motive, then it will not work.
So, I can't begin to imagine how each of the 120 companies that we deal with visualize or make decisions around their own profit. But I would have to imagine that the social good that's created from their products, whether it's from their use, or eventual disposal or the materials that come out of it, those all influence the decisions that are made around how they treat their product, both in the manufacturing and in the use space, but also in the disposal or end-of-life phase. So, the social value or the values that come out of that, they are also included. That being said, I would have to say that they probably all formulate that in a very different way. My venture to guess would be that a lot of the companies that, again, you're more familiar with, they probably put a lot more value on the social and end of life because, that's also a value, but that's also a risk. So when they put resources towards that, there is some return. I think one final thing that's helped kind of give this a push as well is this increased idea in the research and the proven feasibility around circularity. Has helped make end-of-life discussions for products a lot easier to talk about from a financial sense. It's now common accepted knowledge that an electronic component, even though it has no value to a user anymore, still has intrinsic value in there.
Yes, all the way in the back.
Dan. The circular economy theme. Today we haven't talked much about what the recycled material actually ends up in, and I think that could be very useful to know what sort of products this material ends up in. I suspect it may be circular, but it may well be more of a spiral that it goes to a completely different use after it's being recycled. And I just wondered if you could trace that, if instead of thinking about a extended producer responsibility, maybe that material is actually in somebody else's supply chain. So if it ends up that material ends up being in an Apple or a very large electronics company, they may have a responsibility to also look at their supply chain and how those materials are being recycled.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. And that's why I made sure to mention our kind of sister organization, the Responsible Minerals Initiative, which traditionally worked with just conflict minerals, the 3TG minerals, but is kind of expanding that scope a little bit more. And to be honest, right now we're in such kind of an early exploratory process around e-waste as an organization that we haven't made kind of that full circle connection, but I personally would be disappointed if at the end we as the Responsible Business Alliance didn't fully integrate kind of that process into the sourcing kind of arm of our operations, which is the Responsible Minerals Initiative. I think increasingly, and they actually kind of shared their quarterly report with me, you know, they have all these numbers on where gold and tin and other minerals are coming from. And on the sheet it said, and I can't remember it was like S and R, you know, S/R, and I was like, what is this? And they said that's scrap and recycled. So, you know, I think there is a really good value, and I think our members would see value and businesses see value when we can definitively say, or at least confidently say, where, you know, that S&R quantity comes from. That improved traceability, I think, should be part of the portfolio kind of going forward in the plan. But we'll see, you know, it's still very, very early.
I have one more unless somebody else. So I'm sorry that I've forgotten your name, but the person from the Ford Public Health. I was really interested by that comment about considering the autonomy aspect of the e-recycling, the people who are engaging in that. I'm from engineering, and I just wondered, how do you attempt to sort of approach that in your methodology and consider that aspect of e-recycling? I think it's a great comment. I'm struggling to know how to comprehend how to bring it into any sort of analysis. I just would like some advice there, really.
So I assume you're talking to me, Shobita. Yeah, so I think the first thing is to understand the phenomenon. So, and that would require social scientific methods, you know, understand, and to be honest, I do work also in India, also around, you know, sort of interventions, technological interventions like, you know, clean cook stoves, toilets, sanitary pads, many of, you know, as I mentioned, you know, interventions that have had mixed impacts. And what you see in those interventions as well is that there is reticence to adopt these interventions because, you know, they're something that they get out of the current practice, right? This was interesting, I think, in the few interviews that we did because it was quite explicit. People talked about how they didn't want to participate. They actually left maybe formal employment to move into the informal economy because they could set their own hours, have their own business, et cetera. And so, you know, if you were to think about scaling this up, you would do more interviews, you would do more ethnographic observation, but you would also, I mean, if you're thinking about it from an engineering perspective or okay, what do I actually do? How does this change my tinkering? The question is then about how, you know, I think implicitly what we've been talking about all day, which is what does formalization mean? Should we be formalizing these practices through policy, through better kinds of, you know, masks, technical interventions? Can we design technical interventions that maximize autonomy and independence and minimize the feeling of surveillance or of control, of participating in some kind of top-down process or policy, those would be the kinds of things that you would want to ask if once you get to the intervention stage. But I still think there's a lot more work that needs to be done to excavate and understand the actual sentiment. Although, as I said, it's something I'm interested in too, because I think I see that in many places. It's a discomfort, that we see in a lot of places when we're talking about the informal economy, because there's always an assumption that the informal economy is a problem and we need to formalize it, when in fact I think that there's more people than we realize who are choosing to participate in the informal economy for quite legitimate reasons, and we don't have a good understanding of why that is and how that works.
Question about the case in Chile. You mentioned there was an activist, and you kind of teased us on it, and I haven't heard the
Ezekiel. Yeah, okay. But only for Ike? No, yeah, Ezekiel. Yeah, the activism.
I mentioned the activist and I said you would talk about it, and you only talked about it.
Yes. Well, I think we need to study more deeper about this group, but it's super interesting how they mobilize their demands, because they have a really good leader, o sea, digo good in the sense that is so a successful leader. Maybe some forms that they make the collective is a little bit tricky with the people, but they are so they have a hierarchy, so a good hierarchy, and different representations in different part of the country, and they work in a regional platform. There are a lot of groups in South America, and that is framed with this slogan of inclusion recyclers movement in South America. And for this reason, this is a new movement of maybe to move the demand of the poverty, but mainly the recognition as a collective. And yeah, they move many manifestations, street manifestations, and discussion between different governments, and had a lot of successful in links with this bigger transnational network, but with the greener, with the environmental movement too. They have a lot of support to the parliamentary discussions and different laws, and leaders of environmental movements found with this group another chance to put different environmental aspect in the law. And this was so interesting how both groups make some alliance in discussion in front of the companies. And another thing important is there are some Pablo said in the morning, we have a new president, that is our Trump, and the first government of this man, he decided to put the green tax for the companies and all the people, and it was so really higher tax, and the companies. The SOFOFA, the Association of Producers, different kinds of productions, said, yeah, this is so high tax. And this green tax probably was really higher the cost of the fabric. And the recyclers, the movement of recyclers said, yes, for us it's not good, because this is a big problem for us, because we collect all the things. And there was a link between this movement and these producers, and this is, I think, is interesting to follow why they had a link to in the law, because it's really exceptional things in Latin America.
I kept thinking about the formal and informals, and I was thinking that maybe there are like things that are stressing that are not maybe in the definitions. I think one thing is they are legal or not legal. The other thing is that they are small scale or larger scale, you know, like small business, family business, or a big business. And the other is how this gets into the big loop of the economy. And then comes the question for Violeta. Maybe you mentioned that there was a lot of things to measure the amount of e-waste, but are there efforts to measure the amount of circular economy, as you can say, or how much of a share do you have in the circular economy that is happening in every country? And let's say, like, how much circular economy of refrigerators, whatever there is in Chile, for instance, and how much goes in the kind of like the big business, and how much can go to the small business or something?
Thanks for the question. I think it's a great idea. I think the circular economy is relatively new, and still there is a lot of work to be done on measurements and measuring circularity. And as you say, in small and large businesses. So far, there is a lot done in Europe, meaning project funding available for encouraging of including circularity in business models, so circular business models. And most of the projects currently under Horizon 2020, the European Research and Development funding revolves around assessing what circular business models are available and which are suitable for the electronic sector and which are currently being adopted, and what is the gap, and how we can assist with policy and provide pathways for better adoption. And I don't think there is proper and good data available right now to measure the progress done. I think it's still early, and perhaps it's it's something to focus on. I'm sorry I can't be more helpful.
I also wanted to mention just briefly that one other interesting dynamic in terms of distinguishing between formal and informal is formal forms of knowledge and expertise, or formal certifications of knowledge and expertise versus informal. Yeah.
Hello. So we talked with a bunch of people that came from Michigan in January about this. It's kind of like we have the sense that in Chile there is a lot of recycling and reuse that is being done, and is usually done, and it's a good benefit for a lot of people. It's like a lot of people can get like a refrigerator instead of paying $200, can get it for $30. So it's a big saving for a family, you know. And I think that there is no measure at all of how much there is there. And I think that would be like a very good, nice research idea for somebody to do it in Chile. And what we said is kind of like, is something like, maybe it's not something that we will need to create something new in Chile. It's just try to keep what we have. I mean, don't lose it, you know.
I have a question that I would just love to throw out to actually most everybody on the panel. So we've got a country, Chile, that's actually implemented some legislation with regards to e-waste. We have a country, Thailand, which has tried a couple times, but not quite there. I'm curious, what would the recommendations from those two countries be for a country like Ghana that hasn't even, to my knowledge, approached the concept of legislation yet? I mean, are there sort of takeaway recommendations you would have for how a country could do this efficiently and effectively?
I'm not sure, because you give us some homework, before attending a workshop. I read one paper, and apparently maybe Ghana would having the legislation coming pretty soon. I'm not quite sure about that. But anyway, I think it would be interesting to answer your question anyway. I think what we learned from this process of drafting many legislation in many forms is we should look into other countries. Actually, we have learned quite a lot when we developing the draft law, but not from the EU directive, not from the most well-known one, like the one in Japan, but the one in Taiwan. It less discussed in the literature and also in many circles, but it's not quite successful and really kind of thoughtful, because they failed for a decade and then they have the new system. And I think I really appreciate the comment of the previous presenter that we don't have one policy that can solve all the problem. There is no one size fit all. I mentioned the issue in Taiwan, but actually South Korea have the opposite direction. They first start with like the kind of governmental fund, deposit refund system, but mandatory, managed by the government in the first decade, then fail. Then they implement the EPR style like in the OECD and in Europe. They was quite successful. So it go in the opposite direction. What we can learn is not the form of different policy that has been implemented, but we need to study the factor. What are the factors that contributing to the success of the policy and the trust in between the government and the industry? I think that's one of the factor that would decide on what kind of policy would be able to work in that country. So I could not say whether the option 1 or B is best for any country. I mean, you need to understand your own context. But it's good to look into other countries to see the example, because otherwise we kind of discuss in the air. We need to really see the concrete example. So I think I pass that to you.
I would like to talk about Latin America experience that I know more. You know, there is 4 countries that they have already law in waste. And those from 4 is Colombia, Peru, Brazil, no, Colombia, Peru, Chile in this moment, and Costa Rica. And in Colombia, Peru, and Costa Rica, they were supported by experts from outside. Colombia and Peru were supported by EMPA from Switzerland. And we work also from the Latin American point of view. We did put the subject in Latin America with EMPA. So it's very important to have some financials and expert support, and they are working really well together. And in Costa Rica, they work with someone from Holland, from, how do you say Holland? Holland? Okay. Yes. And yes, Netherlands. And I think that's one way. That is not the only way, of course. And in Chile, well, we said we are an OECD country, but beside that, we worked about more than 10 years. So it's not a process, it's a very long process. Mm-hmm.
I actually wanted to, I don't come from any of those countries, but I guess I wanted to say that the way that I would analyze that question or answer that question would be to ask, I think it's important to structure the question. So the first would be, what is Ghana's history of similar laws? The second question would be, and I think this is extremely important in the developing world context, and I'm really very much influenced by the India example, is what is the record of these kinds of laws actually being implemented on the ground? Because I think that in those countries you can have laws, but they're not properly implemented. And then finally, I think from the Chilean case in particular, one question you would want to ask is there a clear set of representatives of the e-waste workers or the informal workers? Is there a charismatic activist? That might be too much to ask, but is there an actual representative who can provide that perspective to actually produce a law that could be created, written, and implemented in a way that would work?
I want to contribute to the e-waste legislation in Ghana. We do have one that came out in late 2016 or early 2017. But like I said, it's a question of what do these laws do you just would have a law on paper and nothing happens. The key issue here is why do we have, the informal sector groups doing e-waste recycling? It is because we lack the recycling infrastructure. And number two, like authorities know very well that we do not have capacity to recycle this at the formal level. So basically, it will still go to this, and then nobody will say, well, take anybody to court or throw someone to jail for, going to Agbogboshe to do recycling. So it doesn't still work.
It's a great point. In fact, we have another question. Yeah, please, Ravi.
Just want to add to the discussion on implementation. You can have laws, or the laws may not be implemented, especially in developing countries. But even in developed countries, how you implement the law matters. We have experts from Europe, but what I understand is the first pass in Germany of implementing e-waste law was a disaster because governments create monopolies and standard economic rules about what monopolies do, we all know. This creates humongous cost structure, which was very painful. Then the parallel, so coming back to somebody raised the question of do you make it for profits or not, private sector doesn't necessarily intervene only for profit. So in the European case, 4 private sector companies come together, fed up with the government monopoly of how they implement e-waste laws, form their own consortium called the European Recycling Platform, and inject competition in the recycling sector. And that dramatically reduces the cost of recycling. Because you have to make it, so just because, if you leave out the profit motive, business perspective has to be brought in terms of, if you can't do it efficiently enough, you're fooling yourself. So you have to think about this, whether that efficiency comes from informal sector or formal sector, that's a whole different issue. But I think how you implement laws is very important that you have to keep in mind. And I wouldn't necessarily trust the government to do the right thing to implement the laws. I mean, they should enforce it. But there could be other ways private sector can play a very important role in how the entire recycling infrastructure could work.
Okay, it looks like that may have been our last question. So, okay, please, Dr. Austin Brenneman, yeah.
Hey guys, so I had just a question about, I think we're talking a lot about the different objectives that different stakeholders have. And so you were talking about sort of, business people have certain objectives, governments and different people within those governments have different objectives. Are there ways when we're talking about what is a problem or what is better, right? So I think of more of things like what is better, right? You have some sort of option. Are there better options? Does it even exist? How do your different disciplines or your sort of perspectives around defining better? So, we were talking about environmental impact before versus social impact, and I can get into the technical, like, how do I measure this? But I have to have some way of making, you're talking about it being a political decision or a social decision, and different people are going to view that in different ways. What are sort of the analytical frameworks that you guys bring to it to think about what it means to be better? Like, as a designer, I can try and say, this will meet what you want, but I have to sort of know what you want. And that was sort of what I was trying to bring up earlier, was like, how do we decide among all these variety of stakeholders what people want so we can try and think about how to get there, right? So maybe if you guys could talk a little bit about, if it were you, how you would think about these different actors and maybe approach different ways of thinking about what they want. I guess that's my question.
So will the question remain what people want or what works? People could tell you, so for most of the time, people don't even know what they want. didn't find it very suitable for their purpose. So then they went back, with this mass burning. They replaced some of the machines, but well, they could not really use them for the tiny copper wires that they have in the system. So they still burn. So it would take just more than what people want to solve this problem. But I think what will do the work would be experience. I mean, put everybody on the table, see what is available. I mean, it will be context specific. It will also be, a big material life cycle analysis, or even material analysis like component analysis. For example, in Agbogbloshie, we haven't done much of material flow analysis. I know that someone from Germany came recently and did a study just looking at trying to quantify the materials in the waste stream. And of course, I was wondering how she did this. Like Agbogbloshie is an open place. We do not know all the routes. I know a few. And so the question is, if you even wanted to find out the daily quantities, daily flows of material in Agbogbloshie, for example, it's going to be very problematic. And we are considering doing a more systematic material flow analysis. But this is not going to, often I tie this to student dissertations, and they do this over only short time. We cannot do this. We don't have money to, go to the place and really, try to do a long-term systematic analysis of the materials that come in. Then you are able to better tell what type of technology to use. Because if you don't have this information, you are going to probably just take wrong decisions. Because you do not know, you do not have the real facts.
Short things about the model, or how we can help the people, because I suppose in general we expect that we help people. We are working and to construct a better world and all the things. But sometimes I think it's important to take into account that we not every time we make things. For this reason, I think it's so interesting that Shobita said in terms of maybe the informal practices. There are a lot of things that we don't see in this moment, and all the form that we make some valorizations on numbers and all the things to put in these practices, probably it's not good for this group, and another group is super good. Sometimes we think in a model that make the solutions for all the groups. Sometimes I think about in these things to be caring, not responding, caring for some groups. Sometimes maybe it's not so important. I don't know, it's a visibility of the dates, how you make the things, and I conduct with the idea of the methodology. When you use some method, you can change the things that you don't see before. For us, the workshop with the recyclers after the dates was to take into account the knowledge of the people. And this knowledge of the people are not necessarily in accountability. When you make too many quantity and quality things, but you have to think, I think, is more in a humility, or said, yeah, the knowledge is important. My knowledge can help you, but I need to hear. And this is super important for us, the different knowledge that the recycler have already. And how you make this visibility and the norms and the limits and the standards and all the things. I think it's interesting to put in contact our methodologies with different kind of methodologies and data, but hearing this knowledge. You can see, and maybe you say, I help these people, and at the end you don't help. to all the people, and they know they are polluted. They know it. But what is the limit? This is a question of ethics and moral, and it's analytic too. It's analytic how we make some methodologies that include this point of view. I think it's a big challenge.
So one, just to pick up on what Gloria said, because although she said it quite well, is that there are two ways of thinking about it. One is methodology that I think it sounds like you used, which is a deliberative democracy model of bringing together, e-waste workers and having them, sort of engage in this. But I think in those processes, we as researchers or analysts have to be really careful about the scope of the question that we ask, the kinds of questions that we ask, right? So what would work better is one kind of question. What do you want is a different kind of question. There are still yet other questions, right? And the answers to those questions could have absolutely nothing to do with e-waste, right? And then the question is, what do we do? What are our ethics if we get that kind of response? Which is probably likely, but it's also telling because it suggests that whatever intervention we might come up with might not be used because, in fact, e-waste is not the present problem, right? But the deliberative democracy model, I think, is a pretty well-worn methodology to try to think about this, but it's often not, it's been used around technology, but it's often used to sort of say, how should we build this thing? What would make it better? And I actually think that that's problematic because it's not, the scope is too narrow. Another way from a social science perspective is to sort of do in-depth work to try to understand all of the different ways in which better gets defined and to see, because that I think provides some sense of what the scope of the problem is and what the kinds of divisions are. But that still wouldn't get at the question of whether or not the people would ever actually use whatever intervention seems to be the majority vote.
Excellent. So thank you all. Unfortunately, I want to be respectful of everyone's time, so we'll have to wrap up our discussion here, but just a round of applause for our panelists.